there to cut that off. Cami Kronish has her hands on her head already.
It's over. Here's Giguère, wrist shot, paddled away. In the slot, cleared, and Ohio State has done it. National champions for the first time.
Hello, my name is Emmie Chapman, and I have recently conducted research for this documentary with a specific question in mind, which is, what would be the impact of implementing a women's varsity hockey program at Michigan? I chose this topic because growing up, I was always forced to go to my older sister's hockey games, and I like to tell people that I grew up in a hockey rink because I was in one every weekend. Seriously, every weekend, whether it was a home game or an away game 2 hours from my house. I've even worked at 2 different ice rinks starting from when I turned 16 years old. I hated going to those games until one day I eventually saw the beauty of the sport, and I learned to really love hockey. It may help that my family is full of Detroit Red Wings fans too, and I was always forced to go to those games. But looking back at it now, I think hockey may be in my blood. My favorite thing to do at Michigan has been being part of the Children of Yost and being able to watch an elite D1 men's hockey program. I've especially become passionate about advocating for more exposure to women in hockey. Every year that the Winter Olympics come around, I post it on every single social media, and my favorite thing to do is watch the women's hockey matches. The rival games between the USA and Canada have been my favorite to watch, especially in recent years. And when I first started attending school at the University of Michigan, I couldn't understand why there wasn't a varsity women's hockey program. After all, Michigan seems to be the definition of hockey school, and there's no way that we can let Ohio State beat us with having a varsity women's hockey program. So I wanted to work on this documentary for myself, my sister, and all the little girls who dream of becoming hockey players. This one's for us. So, to start off this documentary, I just want to talk a little bit about the history of hockey at Michigan. What the men's team went through in their early years sounds similar to what the women's club hockey program is going through and has gone through. So, initially, the men's varsity hockey team started as the Huron Hockey Club because they played on the Huron River, and they had their own humble beginnings. They first requested to be recognized as varsity in 1911, but were unfortunately denied. Then, 2 years later, in 1913, they asked for a small amount of money of funding from the university to contribute to their program and to play games, but they were denied from that. Then, in 1914, they once again requested varsity status, but were denied. And this team had to watch the board in control of intercollegiate athletics at the university grant varsity status to several other sports teams in between these years. They saw cross country, swimming, wrestling, golf, soccer, rifle shooting, and bowling, which rifle shooting is unheard of now, become varsity. So after 1914, it would be 6 years before they dared to request anything from the board again. In 1920, which was 6 years later, obviously, they were granted an informal team status from the board. Then eventually, in 1922, they eventually gained full varsity status. And, it did take them 11 years, but they persevered and finally got what they wanted. So, to follow up with that, the women's club team was founded in 1994, and interestingly enough, the first time the Olympics would include women's hockey in the games was 1998. And some people say that was a year that women's hockey would really start to gain momentum. And the women's club team at Michigan did work to capitalize on that. But unfortunately, it came to no avail. They went up for varsity during the 1996-1997 school year because they wanted to make that push for their program. And during that time, the school was looking to promote one men's team and one women's team to that status. Unfortunately, it did not end up being the women's hockey team. It ended up them promoting women's water polo. And the one other time, funnily enough, The team went up for varsity status in 2011, but women's lacrosse was chosen instead. So that's a little bit about the history of the women's club team. And it's important to note that the men's team at Michigan has seen many successes. So it's only safe to say that a women's program at the University of Michigan would likely face the same successes. I mean, the men's varsity hockey program has gone to 36% of Frozen Fours with 27 appearances since the tournament began, which actually is the most appearances of any school. And what's also really important to mention are the successes of the women's programs in the Big Ten Conference. Ohio State's women's hockey team won the national championship in 2022, and Wisconsin's women's hockey program won in 2023. And actually, those are the videos inserted of them winning at the beginning of this documentary. And in 2017, according to a New York Times article, Wisconsin and Minnesota had already won 10 out of the 17 NCAA tournaments for women's hockey. And the tournament only started in 2001. And even though many of Michigan's Big Ten companions, and a few of them are even rivals, I'm talking about Minnesota, Wisconsin, Penn State, Ohio State, they're becoming women's hockey hubs, and that's really important. But this hasn't seemed to motivate Michigan to promote their women's team to varsity status. And it's no easy decision, but it's definitely something to take into account. I mean, Penn State promoted their men's and women's programs simultaneously in 2011, although a lot of people say that was just the luck of receiving a significant donation to fund them both. So to continue on this, I spoke to the head coach of the women's club hockey program right now, Coach Jenna Trubiano. She used to play on the club hockey team when she went here. She recently participated in an interview with me, thanks to her. And I really was sure to ask about these Big Ten teams' impact on Michigan as they're part of our conference. And before, I mentioned that Ohio State had previously won the national championship in 2022. And when I asked her about this, she was confident in saying that Ohio State, being as good as they are, is the best thing to ever happen to the women's club hockey program. And here's her explanation as to why.
But if you look at the top 10, top 15 programs for women's Division I, it's Wisconsin, Ohio State, Minnesota's up there, Penn State's going to get there for sure. Because a lot of students want that experience. Like, they want to go to a school where they have a lot of pride. They're getting that Big Ten education. They've got the alumni base that's going to carry them beyond their 4 years versus a lot of smaller schools where you may not have that. So I think it's exciting to see Ohio State be successful, because I think they're built pretty similar to Michigan in terms of the athletic department revolves around football, but they're still able to support something that is so unique.
And right now, there are plenty of challenges being faced by the women's club hockey team. One of the most essential sources for my findings was an article from the Michigan Daily about the absence of a women's varsity hockey team. This article in Trubiano outlined the difficulties that come with playing club hockey at Michigan. The club team has to fund every single thing that they do. They pay for their ice time, new equipment, travel expenses, and for a trainer to be present at their games, which is a requirement. And to fund this, they typically put on fundraisers, apply for grants from Michigan's Central Student Government Student Org Funding Committee, all that type of stuff. And Trubiano also told me that they have started to alter their process for potential players. They typically have prospect gates at the end of each season for admitted students to see who may show up for tryouts. And she also told me that they've been making verbal commitments to admitted players, though they still have to go through the tryout process, and this helps them figure out what their roster may look like and how much to order of what. And things have started to move in a positive direction for this team. Coach Trujillo told me that the president's office has reimbursed them for last season's expenses and will also reimburse them for this season's expenses. And she told me that they're extremely grateful for President Ono's support. And it is true, President Ono is a big supporter of the women's hockey program, and he is open to the idea of a varsity program. But in some interviews, he does say that the university president should not be the one to decide whether this happens or not. And President Ono could possibly be right about that last statement. According to an article from the Michigan Daily interviewing President Ono, many questions are associated with the possibility of a women's varsity hockey team. One, but not limited to, is whether the women would play at Yost. There would have to be a conversation about tremendous renovations to Yost to fit both teams, because that's not what it's built for, or the building of a brand new facility, which would come out to be extremely expensive. Then, there would also have to be in-depth conversations with the NCAA and possible conferences, which, of course, takes time. Not to mention that a lot of other women's sports can be way less expensive than hockey. According to a New York Times article in 2017, the University of North Dakota dropped its women's varsity hockey program despite being a top national program. The lack of women's hockey programs don't seem to be an issue of gender bias either. It truly does seem to be the cost. But it is important to note that in 2022, a prospective player of UND women's hockey before the program was scrapped, and someone who just said that they would play hockey there if they could, filed a lawsuit against UND claiming that they violated Title IX by getting rid of the women's hockey program. Well, it is important to note that the judge did rule that in favor of UND because he said these girls' situations were hypothetical. Now, if it were an issue of Title IX, that's a different story, but from what I found, it's not really in what I've explored. I mean, for me, it's more the cost. The University of North Dakota women's hockey program had supposedly cost the university $2 million a year, and the president noted that in order to revive the program, they would need to raise at least $60 million, which is super expensive. So, it's not just something that can be easily done, and I respect that. So kind of leading into the conclusion, I just want to say the women's club team plays in Division I in the ACHA, and oftentimes this conference is labeled just as an alternative to the NCAA, and it honestly can be relatively competitive. Some schools within this conference are fully funded by their university and listed as varsity sports. But also within the conference, you have schools such as Michigan and Arizona State that fund these conference endeavors themselves. However, this leads me into saying that if a girl hockey player wants to stay in Michigan and they want to play NCAA women's hockey, there are just no options. To be frank, the state has 7 NCAA D1 men's programs, while there are 0 for women. This means that if a girl wants to play D1 hockey, it's not going to happen in Michigan, and I was sure to ask Coach Trujillo about the lack of programs and what it would mean for Michigan to be the first.
For my network in the women's hockey world, if somebody was a Michigan State fan, they would go to Michigan State if they could play Division I hockey. Mm-hmm. They would go to Michigan and play Division I hockey if they were a Michigan fan. But going through the recruiting process, especially at the highest level in the state of Michigan, the coaches, as they're educating you about programs, you basically cross every school in the state of Michigan off your list. And that's why I never looked at Michigan. I was looking at really strong academic schools outside of the state because I never considered it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I definitely think there'd be a lot of interest, and think about the proximity to Canada, who also has a lot of women's hockey talent. I mean, Ann Arbor is about an hour from the border if you're going through Windsor, and Ontario, like the Toronto area, is a very a very strong hockey hotbed. So, especially with the transfer portal, I think a varsity program would be very competitive within 5 years at most.
And to start closing on this, I just want to mention that I interviewed sports journalist Eric Adelson, and he was confident in saying that Michigan would be an instant national title contender. Women's hockey is already advancing at a fast rate, and he said that it will continue with or without Michigan, and that Michigan should want to implement a women's varsity hockey program. This could be something that would separate them from other universities in the state, especially concerning Michigan State as one of our rival schools at Michigan, because this would be the first D1 NCAA program in the state. And Mr. Adelson also talked about how a lot of women hockey players are exceptional students, and as there aren't that many opportunities for women to play professional hockey, they will go on to contribute in their chosen careers. So by having a D1 program, Michigan is not only able to offer the true athletic experience, but a good education as well. And that could be a real selling point, the degree that these girls would get if they played here. And Mr. Adelson believes that it would be significant for recruiting purposes to be able to offer those two stable items. And I'd have to agree, you're going to get the players that you want by offering them what they want. And in our conversation, he also discussed that these women oftentimes turn out to be some of our best leaders, and I want to share a little clip of that.
It's not just about the attendance at the games. It's about that these players are going to be leaders, and they are going to represent your school in the future. Which school do you want them to represent? Do you want them to represent Michigan, or do you want them to represent a rival to Michigan? And ultimately, the president and the athletic director have to figure out what their answer to that question is going to be.
And I want to leave with a few final thoughts. What he and I talked about that wasn't included in that last clip was the opportunity costs that come with not having a women's varsity hockey program. But he does talk about in the little bit of the last clip is, does the University of Michigan want women leaders to go and develop their skills at Ohio State? Or does the university want these women to say that they were able to develop their leadership skills at the University of Michigan? Because as Mr. Adelson was saying, and I don't think it was included in the last clip, was that these women will go and contribute so much to the world, to their communities, they will give back, and that is a big opportunity cost. And, the university should realize that the funding of a women's varsity hockey program, no matter how expensive it is worth getting these women to come here, develop their skills here, and say that they went to the University of Michigan. And that could be something really special. And one last final thought that is kind of to wrap it up is that when Coach Hutch came in to speak to our class, she talked about how men's sports have had so much more exposure than women's sports. And my hope is that, women's hockey is really starting to get its real exposure. And with that real exposure is going to come with more women's college hockey programs, not just at the university, but everywhere in the whole country. And, I hope, because Trubiano and Adelson are optimistic that a women's hockey program is coming within 3 to 5 years, I hope that someday my kids are able to see these women's college hockey programs thriving. Thank you so much for listening.